Welcome to the thematic sessions of the ASF 2026. We are kick-starting the thematic sessions with this subsession 1 under the track 3. If you know what is track 3 is about forging inclusion in developing energy systems, strategy, and planning. And if you ask me what it is, I don't know. Not really. I'm allowing the esteemed speakers to talk about it. We have 4 sessions lined up starting now, and then one after this, and a couple of subsessions tomorrow morning. So without taking much time, let me introduce myself. I am Ranishka Vimalasena from the Asian Development Bank, co-chair for track 3, along with the co-chair Ellen. So I'll introduce Ellen, and then Ellen will take the controls of the proceedings. So Ellen Bomesang is a very familiar face for ADB ASF. She's a global energy and climate leader with over 25 years of experience in clean energy transition as well as developing emerging and developing markets. Her work spans on policy and planning, power sector reforms, energy access, and institutional strengthening. She has advised the governments, the municipalities, and also the communities across the whole range of stakeholders. She has advanced women's representation and leadership, expanded women's access to finance, promoted STEM education for girls, and so on. The list goes on, Ellen. I take the liberty of not going through the entire bio because I can speak for many minutes about her experience. She has worked on programs and initiatives supporting community-led and decentralized electrification, transition finance, public-private partnerships, and workforce capacity building, translating strategy into implementation, while advancing just inclusive energy transition worldwide. And her experience spans over many esteemed organizations, including her current role at Winbay Technologies as a senior energy transition and equity advisor. Please put your hands together to welcome the moderator and the co-chair for track 3, Ellen Bomesang.
Thanks, Ranishka. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here and moderating, co-chairing this track and moderating this very first session. I'm excited to hear from our 4 panelists today. Just to set the scene a bit, as countries across Asia and the Pacific accelerate the clean energy transition, the question is no longer only how quickly we can decarbonize, but how we do so in a way that is inclusive, equitable, and responsive to the needs of all communities. So energy policies shape not only our power systems, but also access to opportunity, economic participation, resilience, and the quality of life. So embedding equity into these frameworks means ensuring that the benefits of the transition are broadly shared, that vulnerable and underserved populations are meaningfully included in decision-making, and that we avoid replicating existing disparities as we build the energy systems of the future. So we have 4 presenters presenting evidence from across the region. Our first presenter will share findings from Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia, where an analysis of more than 100 energy-related policies through a just transition lens reveals both promising practices and persistent gaps. Our second presenter will showcase new empirical evidence from Bangladesh, Pakistan, the People's Republic of China, and Sri Lanka on the gendered dimensions of rural energy access and use. Our third presenter will examine how the Green Power Corridor framework can help integrate equity considerations into the planning and implementation of power connectivity projects. And finally, our fourth presenter will highlight the experiences of countries to show that a just energy transition requires indigenous peoples' rights, leadership, and the principle of free, prior, and informed consent to be at the center of energy policies and projects. So just a quick overview of how this session is structured. So we have an hour and a half, starting with individual presentations from each of our 4 experts, followed by a moderated panel discussion, and then we will take questions from the audience. And you can also submit questions through the Huva app. So our panelists have promised to stick to their 9 minutes to make sure that everyone has their full-time allocation and that we have time for a fruitful discussion. So in the interest of time, I will not share their detailed bios, as you can find these in the Huva app and in the ASEF website. I'll go to our first presenter. Let me call on Veronica Muller, a senior consultant in Just Transition, Energy, and Cohesion Policy from EcoRIS, who will be presenting on Bridging Policy and Reality, Strengthening Justice in Southeast Asia's Energy Transition.
Thank you, Ellen, for the introduction, and welcome and good afternoon to all of you. I'm here today as a senior consultant. I work at EcoRIS, and we're a research-based consultancy with offices in Belgium, the Netherlands, but also India, Zambia, and other countries. And I have worked for the last couple of years on what we call just energy transition, and I'm here today to share some results from a project that we finished relatively recently. It was July last year. And this is a study that we did for Terra Climate Foundation, which we tried to map just transition elements supporting the energy policy in 4 countries, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia. And the whole kind of context behind the study is that, and we've heard this already quite a few times this morning, decarbonization is progressing rapidly, but what we really need is this inclusive and people-centered approach to not just policy making, but also to policy implementation. So to better understand where we stand at the moment, we looked at policies from mentioned countries, national level policies to be precise, and this includes more strategic policy documents and guidelines, but also really regulatory acts and financing mechanisms. And we analyzed those at 2 levels. So the first, say broader, more quantitative analysis was based on up to 30 policies per country, where we counted like keywords relating to just transition. And then in each of the 4 countries, we selected the 10, let's say, most important policies for energy transition and did a deeper analysis of the what we call level of ambition within the just transition principles. So there we used a specific and tailored indicator framework for the Southeast Asian context. Maybe just a quick show of hands, and to also wake you up is, are there any participants from the 4 countries, from the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand? And please raise your hand. Great. I hope the results are equally interesting, though, for all of you who are not from those 4 countries. So just as an introduction, I'll show you a bit the framework that we used for this whole study, because just transition, it's always difficult to define. There's no universal, let's say, term for it. So what we mean by that are these 6 principles that you can see on the screen. So for us, and within the context of this study, we look particularly on about the governance mechanisms, whether these are transparent and inclusive. Under principle 2, we mean meaningful and inclusive stakeholder engagement. So taking into account opinions of those most affected. In many other, I think, studies, this is also considered as procedural justice. Under principle 3, we looked at the specific consideration of the needs of vulnerable groups, also known often as recognition and distributional justice. Under principle 4, we understood any references to workforce transition measures, so really looking at reskilling and upskilling of workforce. Principle 5 looks at economic diversification, so any investment into entrepreneurship, startups, innovation. And Principle 6, which is often considered restorative justice, looks at environmental rehabilitation and land repurposing of former fossil fuel infrastructure. So you'll see this legend pop up a couple of times in my presentation, but without further ado, I want to show you some key findings in each of the countries, starting with Indonesia, where we assessed a total of 29 policies and counted at the higher level a total of 5,000 references to the 6 just transition principles. And on the chart that you can see here, it shows that principles 2, so meaningful stakeholder engagement, and principle 6 on environmental rehabilitation are those most frequently mentioned. But when we looked more deeply into what it actually says within those policies, it actually came out that even though it's not mentioned so frequently, it is actually principle 1 that is most concretely described and most ambitiously formulated. As in Indonesian policy, coordination is quite a basic requirement for each policy. What is least ambitiously or least concretely formulated are principles 4 and 5 on the equitable workforce transition and economic diversification. That's because Indonesian policy really mostly looks at the infrastructural aspects and energy aspects of the transition. And what we also did within each country was look at the more chronological order of things. So across the years, we see that especially in 2009, 2010, focus was really on the land rehabilitation aspects, whereas more recently with Just Energy Transition Partnership, especially in 2021, 2022, the references to other principles are equally increasing. Now, moving on to the Philippines, we looked at 24 policies in total, and we counted a total of 3,300 word references to anything related to the 6 principles. And here you can also see it's Principle 6 on land rehabilitation that is most frequently mentioned. However, again, we looked more closely into what is actually said in the policies and found that, again, Principle 1 and 2 are those most clearly formulated, even though not mentioned as frequently. What we also noticed is that more strategic documents have higher references to the 6 principles than the legislation does. And in a temporal view, we also see that the Philippines has really increased their, let's say, respect to or references to just transition principles in the last years, especially in 2023 with the Just Transition Program in the making and the ADB's energy transition mechanism kicking in. In Malaysia, we looked at a total of 27 policies and counted 3,500 references, mostly to with respect to Principle 4, the workforce transition principle, and Principle 5 on economic diversification. Similarly, again, as to Indonesia and the Philippines, it's the Principle 1 and 2, though, that are most clearly explained and articulated in Malaysian policy, while Principle 3 stands out as the one least articulated, despite the indigenous community in insular Malaysia, especially affected by the energy transition. And what we also see in Malaysia here, frequency is higher in the later 2010s with policies like the Skills Development Fund Act and the Employment Insurance Act that is responsible for the peaks in 2015. And at the end, Thailand, here we counted a total of 1,500 references in 30 policies. And here the picture is quite different. So references to economic diversification and workforce development are the ones most frequently counted. And they're also the ones that are most ambitiously or most clearly articulated. While Principle 1, it is not counted very often, as you can see on the very left here. It is also not formulated very clearly. So in Thailand, we really see this lack of kind of governance system and coordination within the just transition space, or just energy transition space. And also here, in a chronological order, it's also quite a mixed bag in Thailand. Now, just at the end, I have 1 minute, I see. The cross-country comparison, which we did at the end, I already pointed to it, but what we see really is that just transition is quite inconsistently used, covering various principles, but we also see that these principles are increasingly mainstreamed into the national policy frameworks of the 4 countries. The emergence and the usage of the principles really varies between the 4. As I already said, in Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia, we see the articulation of governance mechanisms and stakeholder engagement as quite strong, whereas in Thailand, it's rather the opposite. And I won't be able to go too much into detail here. What we tried to also start analyzing a little bit, but this would require, I think, a lot more deeper research, is that we looked at what the ambition was in the written policy, so what is there on paper. But what we heard quite frequently from stakeholders that we interviewed and that we talked to in also some workshops was that this ambition and the promises written on paper do not necessarily translate into implementation on the ground. So I think this is what we will also discuss later in the panel discussion, is what is really the issue, is how does what is in policy translate to the local stakeholders there. I think I'm out of time, so just a quick recap of the key recommendations. These are mostly targeted at, I would say, governments, but also there to inform civil society and help them in their advocacy work. So I think we'll touch upon some of these in the panel discussion, and I'll wrap up here. Thank you for your attention. I'll give you a few seconds to scan the QR code if you want to read the full report. And I'm also here with my colleague Ivona for the rest of ASEF. So if you want to have some deeper discussions with us outside this setting, then happy to do so. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronica. So we'll quickly move on to our second presenter, Dina Ashgalieva, Senior Economist, Climate Change from the Asian Development Bank. Her presentation will be on gender and energy, unveiling the nexus of equality and sustainability.
Thank you very much, Hélène. So let's start with polling. I would really like to know your information, to hear from you. You can put your mobile phone with camera on, and that will lead you to the polling. So just put your camera on, and it will lead to a link. Okay, great. Let's start polling. What do you think is the biggest barrier to reducing women resilience on solid fuels? Can we see, please, results screen? Yeah, so we can see answers coming. First answer, lack of affordable clean energy options. Second, limited decision-making power of women. Third, social norms and traditional gender roles. Fourth, insufficient infrastructure and access. And fifth, lack of awareness about health impacts. So it's interesting to know, what do you think is the biggest barrier for reducing women reliance on solid fuels? So the first two. Okay, the first one on top is social norms and traditional gender roles. Thank you so much. So actually, this helps me with my next slide. Back to the slide. So about this, many people ask me, so Dina, you are doing research on gender and energy. What gender to do with energy? So here's the quick answer. If you're also wondering, it's becoming from traditional norms on expectations from women and girls. They are usually expected to collect fuel, take care of cooking and heating. So obviously you probably understand that it takes more hours per day, right? But can you guess how many hours per day extra for women and girls to spend on this? So here's the answer. Daily, it's on average 2 extra hours for gathering biomass and 3 extra hours for cooking and heating. So obviously this, if you put together, that's 5 hours, right? And this takes time which could be used for education or employment opportunities. So for these daily hours, women and girls losing from education and employment. Additionally to that, because women and children spend more time indoors, they are more likely to experience household air pollution. And children account for 60% of premature death due to household air pollution, and also indoor pollution, one of the most prominent causes of early mortality. So here I will provide you evidence from different countries. So if you think who is more likely to be energy poor, energy poverty means the burden on buying energy, for paying for energy is higher. So that's called energy poverty. So here evidence from Rural People's Republic of China shows that female-headed households are more likely to be energy poor. They have higher level of energy poverty than male-headed households, and also they have less likely to access clean energy for cooking and heating. And also the age matters here. With recent evidence, menopausal women, especially rural areas, are more vulnerable to energy poverty than non-menopausal women. And this is mainly because of lower income. So what solutions could it be? The evidence shows that education plays a great role. Those who are more educated, education helps. And also urban living helps. So why urban living helps? Probably due to greater energy access, cleaner energy access, and also maybe healthcare access. Another evidence shows about electrification, how electrification helps to women and girls. So electrification or electrical appliances greatly help with household chores, right? And the evidence from rural Bangladesh shows that women employment improved after electrification. So they started to spend less time for domestic work and caregiving, so that saved them time. And they could increase time for agricultural work, and they increased time for leisure. And also this helped them to increase role in household and agricultural decision-making after electrification. In rural Pakistan, the evidence shows on education. So what do you think happens to education after electrification or electric appliances increased? The dropout rates decreased, and the impact is stronger on girls than boys. And years of education increased, and the impact again stronger for girls than boys. So you can see both women and girls benefit from electrification and electrical appliances. Let's take another poll. I'm interested in your opinion. What do you think role play in clean energy transition? Can we have a Slido? Thank you. Yeah, please use your camera of the phone, and you can read this QR code to answer this question. What do you think women play a role in clean energy transition? Is it primarily beneficiaries? Is it important contributors, drivers, or is it both, or not sure? Okay, great. I can see most of you answered that it's women are both beneficiaries and drivers. Okay, thank you very much. So let me take you to the next evidence, which shows how women could be drivers. The evidence here from Sri Lanka that shows that female-headed households are more likely to use clean cooking than male-headed households. But what's important here to differentiate female-headed household between when they are widowed, divorced, or unmarried, which call them de jure, this women who are widowed, divorced, unmarried, and also de facto, when a woman is empowered, so she is the household head, or maybe because male was absent for some time. So we're differentiating this female-headed household between de facto and de jure. So we found that it's mainly for de facto female-headed households who indeed has better access to clean energy. But if you take women who are widowed, divorced, or unmarried, they actually opposite. They are less likely to use clean energy, and they have lower access to clean cooking and lighting. And another evidence from Central Asia showed that what's important is if woman is employed or unemployed. So only when we showed evidence that the woman is employed, then we can see that, yes, women are more likely to use clean energy because of their employment. So the conclusion here that employment could drive clean energy transition. And and that de jure female-headed households who are divorced or widowed, they are vulnerable groups. Yeah. So, and I made a brief presentation because we have very limited time, but we'll have Q&A. So I wanted to also present you this QR code to the full publication. You can access it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dina. So our third presenter will be Ye Jinha from, she's an Economic Affairs Officer from UNESCAP, presenting on the Green Power Corridor Framework, ensuring inclusive and equitable power system connectivity.
Good afternoon, and thank you to ASEF for inviting me to speak on this important topic in this track. So let me start by briefly introducing ESCAP, where I work, for those who are not familiar with our organization. So ESCAP, which stands for the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, is the regional development arm of the United Nations. And we have 52 member countries, which makes us the largest and most inclusive intergovernmental platform in the region, and with a mandate on energy connectivity. So our mandate on energy connectivity is derived from what we call the Regional Roadmap on Power System Connectivity, which was endorsed by all of our member countries in 2021. And under this regional roadmap is where the Green Power Corridor Framework sits. So that was just an intro to get you to this point, where the Green Power Corridor Framework is kind of like a very broad framework that we try to use for enhancing the outcomes of energy connectivity projects, whether they're domestic or cross-border, in terms of sustainability and inclusiveness. So in developing the Green Power Corridor Framework, we started by asking two key questions. The first question was, what are the essential building blocks or components that are required for any connectivity project? And the second question was then, how do we ensure that these projects are more inclusive and sustainable? So in terms of the first question on building blocks, we find that essentially there are 6 enablers for any connectivity project. And these 6 building blocks are, if you think of it from the operational and structural point of view, there are, of course, infrastructure that are needed. And then to build the infrastructure, you need the financing. And for financing, you need to de-risk the projects and make them bankable. So you need kind of the institutions and regulations that make these projects conducive to being invested in. So then what drives regulations? The regulations are, of course, driven by policymakers. And policymakers are very, very sensitive to voter sentiment, which brings us to social acceptance. So in terms of social acceptance, for every project, it provides a strong signal to policymakers that this is something that the public wants and is willing to back. And it's a way of telling the policymakers to make those political commitments towards changing the regulations that will then trigger all of the cascading impacts to enable all of the other components of power connectivity projects. And also, we oftentimes see social acceptance being a make or break for like project implementation, because in Korea, where I'm from originally, a lot of the kind of the overhead transmission line projects are blocked by the public not wanting those lines and not wanting them going through their property because they perceive issues with environmental concerns, and also like it has an impact on their property value. So they often would protest that and ask for compensation. So early and regular engagement with those stakeholders are very important to kind of accelerate implementation. So the framework, and when we're thinking about the whole holistic picture of how we then build or try to reflect social acceptance into policymaking, and also how to work on the structural enablers, including institutions, infrastructure, financing, and regulations. We have two kind of frameworks or methodologies for taking that on board. And the first on social acceptance is a focus on qualitative aspects. So you want to first find out what the public perception is on these projects through surveys, through focus group discussions and whatnot, and then also quantitatively modeling out some of the socioeconomic benefits, environmental impacts, so doing like a cost-benefit analysis. And then on the structural enablers, we would look at, what are the gaps and, where are the bottlenecks in implementing and designing these projects. So then it takes us to the interesting part of the presentation, which is as a pilot, we did a perception survey of the project between Indonesia and Singapore. So this is a project that develops solar energy in Batam Islands in Indonesia, and those are exported to Singapore for their towards their Singapore's clean energy ambitions. So in our survey, we surveyed 1,000 participants and asked them broadly on these 6 areas: awareness, priorities, impacts, equity, and trust, and trade-offs, and whether they support this kind of trade with Singapore. So on renewable projects themselves, we find that they're pretty high support. 59% found that they support large renewable projects overall. But then 85% said that sharing the benefits equitably are extremely or very important. And 35% said that the projects need to consider community interests. So 35% thought that projects currently consider community interests fairly. So the perception generally on benefits sharing was quite low. And then on also interesting finding, let me caveat this by saying that this is like very early results. These surveys were carried out 2 weeks ago. And so we will verify these results through additional focus group discussions with the local communities. So please take this with a grain of salt. And but going back, the second finding was that there was a discrepancy between how high-income households view these projects versus low-income households. So there was a 33% percentage point gap between the support from high-income households and low-income households. And also there's quite a gap between rural households and urban households. So we're not sure why we're seeing these results, and the interpretation can vary. But basically, I think maybe the high income earners and those living in cities may perceive the benefits to be more directed to them, whereas like the rural households would be the directly impacted communities. So that could be one interpretation. And so in thinking about like the signals, and what the survey is showing, and my time is up, I think and also very low kind of awareness of these projects to begin with. Only 33% have heard about the interconnectivity projects between Indonesia and Singapore. So building a narrative and kind of getting the word out there that there are benefits to these projects is one thing. And then the messenger is also important. We find that there is a difference between messages that are sent out by like credible think tanks, credible CSOs versus businesses, governments. So the trust level varies. So using a very trustworthy messenger is also important. And lastly, there is a deal to be made. So there is a way to design projects and implement projects so that benefits are shared more equitably and in a way that increases inclusiveness. So I'm just going to show this here. These are the actual kind of responses given to the open-ended questions. So you can see here that jobs were extremely important in terms of like how these projects were viewed. So making sure that there's equitable and good quality jobs that are being created through these projects. Yeah, so let me stop here and I'll maybe add on during the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we move on to our fourth and final presentation from Prabindra Shakya, convener of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Network on Extractive Industries and Energy. He'll present Ensuring Equity and Justice in Energy Policy Frameworks.
Thank you, Leila. Good afternoon. Namaste. Dosalapa, everyone. That's the indigenous greeting in the language of my people, Newars, the natives of Kathmandu Valley in Nepal. Firstly, thank you to the Asia Clean Energy Forum for inviting myself and APNI to this wonderful event or session. And before I get into our experiences, get into sharing the experiences of indigenous peoples with the just energy transition, with the focus of ensuring respecting policies of for the rights of indigenous peoples. Let me quickly introduce APNI, Asia Indigenous Peoples Network on Extractive Industries and Energy, which is a regional network of indigenous defenders working with extractive and energy projects affected communities across 10 countries or territories in Asia. We've been working with or supporting more than 30 communities affected by these energy projects, including energy transition projects over the last 10 years of advocacy, particularly to support advocacy at international levels for our rights, including to our lands, territories, and resources, and to self-determination. Why are we talking about indigenous peoples in the context of energy transition? I think we all know the answer. Indigenous peoples, it is estimated that 50% of transition minerals are located in or near the territories of indigenous peoples around the world. And a large percentage of renewable energy potential are also located in marginalized rural communities' lands, particularly of indigenous peoples. Studies have shown that more than 50% of ongoing energy extraction of energy transition minerals are happening in the lands in or near the lands of indigenous peoples. And what we have also seen is these energy transition projects, including mining of transition minerals, hydropower, or solar projects, are reproducing inequality that we have seen in the mining or extraction of traditional minerals, as well as traditional energy projects. And that has been because human rights, meaningful engagement, and traditional knowledge are often overlooked in these so-called clean energy projects. That has been, which has been the experience of the same structural inequalities as fossil fuels. And the impacts have been that there is land dispossession, there is criminalization and even greenwashing in the name of energy transition projects. And particularly concerning for us has been the ongoing ongoing reprisals against the defenders that speak up for their communities and for human rights across the region. We are speaking based on the experiences of communities that we are working with. These are some of the communities that we have directly worked with. For example, indigenous Chek communities that have been affected by copper mining project of Pete AMNT, Aman Mineral, Aman Nusat Tenggara Minerals, PT AMNT in Indonesia. It's an Indonesian name, so sorry for the difficulty in saying that, whereby the communities are currently engaging with the copper mark, which is the assurance framework of copper supply chain, to ensure that their rights are respected by the copper mining of PT AMNT. In Assam, India, we have also seen Adivasi families asserting their rights to free, prior, and informed consent for a large-scale solar wind farm that was to be financed by ADB, but later India had to withdraw the proposal for ADB to finance it because of the community's opposition for the solar wind farm. In Nepal, my country, where hydropower is seen as the means of prosperity, we have seen a lot of communities opposing aggressive push for large-scale and cascade dam projects that are undermining customary land rights, as well as displacing the riverine communities, particularly indigenous peoples. And what we have seen in this very country where we are having this event, the Philippines, is that the push for transition minerals, particularly nickel, gold, has also been continuing without genuine FPIC, as was the practice with traditional minerals, traditional minerals in the past, or ongoing traditional minerals. And again, more concerning is the trend of what we have seen with the criminalization of defenders that we work with, including terrorist tagging of organizations, and even red tagging or bombing of communities in this very country. So in this context, what we have been calling in terms of policy design or policy reforms is having FPIC as the central principle for in the energy policy designs, in the design of energy policies, as well as a development of corporate accountability frameworks. What does FPIC mean in practice? And what does FPIC mean in practice? It is our inherent right, the right of indigenous peoples, built on rooted in our right to self-determination over our lands, territories, and resources, whereby indigenous peoples' consent must be taken freely, that is, without any coercion, manipulation, or undue pressure. Prior consent must be taken. That means consent must be sought or obtained before project approval, design, and before the start of the construction of the project. An informed consent must be taken, whereby affected indigenous communities must have access to all the information about the project, including positive and negative, and access to information in local and understandable format. And within the right to FPIC, the communities hold the right to say yes, no, or yes with conditions to the project, and that decision must be respected by the companies and the government. So when we are saying integrating FPIC into policy design, we are asking the governments and the communities that that energy planning, project planning must include indigenous and frontline communities as decision makers and not just mere consultees or stakeholders. Again, the indigenous communities must be recognized as rights holders, because we are not just beneficiaries. These projects are coming to our lands and territories, not that we are asking for these projects. So the challenge that we have been facing is the communities are seen as mere beneficiaries or consultees or stakeholders rather than the rights holders over their lands, because again the legal framework do not allow that. So secondly, what we need is the legal framework recognize our customary land rights. We have seen this in practice in some countries like the Philippines and Malaysia, But again, most Asian states do not recognize customary land rights of indigenous peoples. And thirdly, what we are asking for is change in the shift in the model of PPP from public-private partnership to a model whereby communities are in the center of these models and again recognized as rights holders and beneficiaries of these energy projects. As a network of indigenous defenders, a key requirement or key ask from APNI is also for defender protection, whereby indigenous defenders must be recognized as promoters or as a key stakeholders, key stakeholders in deciding these projects with requirement for their protection. And then, of course, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge play a key role in ensuring that these projects are sustainable and implemented with respect for the environmental protection. We have seen that there is some progress that has been made. Some states are increasingly referencing to FPIC in national energy and corporate accountability plans. But again, FPIC remains aspirational and rarely legally enforceable at project level. And we've also seen that defenders, again, continue to face criminalization when they raise their voice, and just energy transition frameworks exclude marginalized indigenous peoples. So these are our recommendations again, that FPIC needs to be enshrined in law, whereby companies and states, governments respect the right of indigenous peoples, including their right to say no to projects. States should require companies to conduct and publicly disclose human rights due diligence of these energy projects, and this should happen before and during energy projects are implemented on indigenous territories. Defender protection measures again should be rigid and should be effective, including to end criminalization of indigenous defenders for their legitimate activities to protect their rights. And then, as we have already said earlier, PPP model have not been the public-private partnership model have not been able to center communities as rights holders. So we are asking this model to be adopted so that indigenous communities are put at the center. I've run out of time, so I'll talk more about PCPP model during the panel discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So I would like to invite our 4 experts to the stage so we can have the moderated panel discussion. So I wanted to ask Yejin the first question. Your presentation focused on social acceptance. So in your experience, and not just from the study, how can policymakers build accountability mechanisms that endure changes in administration or put shifts in political priorities?
Thank you, Ellen, for that question. And indeed, policy changes due to governments changing is a huge risk for these like large-scale projects which involve very large investments. So having that long-term commitment and political will is extremely important. So how do we guarantee those? Those in normal circumstances, those are guaranteed by these long-term agreements called like power purchase agreements and so on. But on top of those, there are mechanisms that will support longer-term agreements and kind of locking in the projects, which include having supporting institutions. So, for example, in the case of the ASEAN Power Grid, we have the ASEAN Center for Energy acting as the coordinator of the ASEAN Power Grid. projects. So it kind of provides an additional layer of pressure, if you will, because there's an external body that is pushing these projects forward. So that institutional support and also regulatory support through and regulatory coordination, cooperation that is given through institutions like the ASEAN Center for Energy play a very important role. But going back to the social acceptance angle, I think we have to kind of lock in the benefits for the communities and the key stakeholders very early on. And they have to perceive the actual, and they have to realize and feel the actual benefits coming to them, and that the projects are bringing equitable benefits to the communities. And this kind of creates like a positive reinforcement for policymakers to not stray from the commitments that they have made, regardless of who is in power. And in the case also in the ASEAN Power Grid, for example, the 4 countries, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, have for the last few years implemented the LTMS kind of power trading agreement. And here, I mean, there weren't new infrastructure being built, so it wasn't a huge disruption. But at the same time, the countries saw clear benefits coming out of the LTMS agreement. So then they had the will to go on to the second phase of LTMS, and it's been called the Pathfinder project in all of the ASEAN Power Grid initiative. So there are, since the LTMS agreement has been signed, there has been a huge momentum building for other kind of similar agreements to go ahead. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to ask Praveen the next question. So your presentation highlighted some models that incorporate local or historically marginalized communities, in particular indigenous communities, in energy decision-making processes. So how do we ensure that co-design processes don't devolve into tokenism? And you talked about enshrining FPIC, for instance, into law. Are there any other specific governance structures to measure whether that you can recommend to measure whether indigenous partners have actual, for instance, veto power over project design?
Thanks, Alan. I think, firstly, we don't, kind of frame FPIC as a veto power because it becomes very political that way, particularly in international legal discussions when FPIC, the right to FPIC or the principle or right to FPIC was being developed. There were certain states who kind of did not agree with this concept because they saw FPIC as the veto power. But again, the indigenous people's understanding of FPIC is that it is a collective expression of our right to decide what happens on our lands, territories, and resources. Again, in line with our right to self-determination, which is similar to right of a person to determine what happens with his or her body, her property. So again, rather than let's say interpreting FPIC as a veto power, it is a collective decision-making process whereby indigenous peoples decide what is in the well-being of their communities, of their lands, of their resources, and actually of the wider environment of the Mother Earth. So in the context of energy projects, what we have been lobbying for and what we have seen has worked the best is more of localized and decentralized solutions, whereby, again, indigenous peoples decide how these solutions can be integrated within the national within the national requirements of energy, and national energy plans. What we have seen is these projects that are respectful or that are, that put the well-being of the local communities, indigenous communities, at the same standards, at the same level of the national interest as the governments or business call it, or the commercial interests. I think those are the kind of policies where we have seen co-design processes work the best. And at the same time, these projects also it also give equal consideration to the protection of the environment, to the sustainable use of resources and respect for Mother Earth. And what in more practical terms, what we are promoting for is more indigenous-led solutions. Whereby we have seen our partners in Malaysia co-design processes with indigenous communities in Sabah, Sarawak, as well as my network itself co-design communities with these indigenous remote indigenous communities that have been left out of the national power grid. And these are happening with the co-ownership of these communities, whereby the lands are voluntarily provided by the communities, the designs are made by the communities. All we do is provide financial and technical assistance as per the design, as per the aspirations of the communities. And yeah, I would have loved to share more about those, but again, these are small-scale projects whereby energy is developed by the communities through their own projects. And energy is not just seen as a source of electrification, but also a source of empowerment, for socioeconomic empowerment through productive end use of energy, particularly for women and youth. Yeah, again, unfortunately, I could not show the practical solutions, but this is happening, of course, in Nepal, in Malaysia, in Cambodia, in Philippines. Unfortunately, in this region, it's only happening at a small scale. And again, if the time allows, I think we can talk more about how we can go to utility scale for these solutions.
Thank you. Now, for Veronica, we ran a bit out of time. But from your study and from your experience, or from EcoRace's work in general, so what policies are needed to ensure that the benefits of the energy transition, meaning jobs, infrastructure investment, and lower energy costs, actually reach frontline communities?
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. Yeah, we've heard quite often this morning how the energy transition can bring so many benefits, but yeah, it's not a given that these will reach these frontline communities by default. So yeah, I started introducing this in the presentation already, but what is needed at the very basis are governance systems and frameworks that are well connected, that are coordinated both horizontally between sectors, but also vertically in terms of different governance levels. And what is needed are what we call like justice metrics that help measure also how equitable policy is. I think that is the only way to hold governments also accountable for whether they are actually implementing what is written in their policy. And so far, I think these do not exist yet. I remember last year talking to some Indonesian stakeholders who were saying a just transition monitoring framework for Indonesia was in the making, and I'm curious to know whether this has already developed. But this is the very basis to be able to even evaluate or analyze whether justice is actually served at the ground. And then what many of us already said, I think in the presentations, is the meaningful participation part of the frontline communities, because yeah, policy needs to take into account their specific needs and needs to provide both capacity, technical, but also financial support targeted towards those most affected. And that starts at, first of all, identifying what are these frontline communities that we're talking about. And yeah, we've mentioned women and indigenous groups, but also included there are the youth, that's the informal workers of the fossil fuel sector, working in many of the coal mines, still operating in Indonesia and other countries. So first identifying them, and then really consulting them, and not just using it as the tick box exercise at the very end and at the very last minute when policy is almost passed. And for that, what is needed are these institutionalized and well-funded and timely consultation processes. And maybe at the end also what is also needed to really benefit the frontline communities are economic diversification strategies that are developed at the very local level, because only through these really territorial and local level approaches can you really identify the sectors that can provide the future livelihoods for communities. And it's as much as about fossil fuel phase down as it is about renewable energy phase in. We heard before, history repeats itself, and we're running the risk of exploiting the same communities as before with the critical minerals and with the renewable energy upscaling. So
Okay, thanks, Veronica. So for Dina, I wanted to give you an opportunity to elaborate more on how energy policy can address barriers to access for low-income households, for female-headed households, and for rural households.
Thank you, Elena. Yeah. So when people ask this question, how to promote clean energy among households, many people start thinking about awareness, raising awareness. But I disagree. I think awareness already very high. We measured awareness in Central Asia among households. The awareness was between 60 to 80% of households already aware. So I think in many other countries, same because of social media and news. But households still don't choose clean energy even when they know about all these environmental and health issues because of other things they prioritize. So first of all, what we ask them, what do you prioritize? First of all, is there clean energy access? Are there alternatives at all? Yes or no, right? So of course, in many countries already 100% electrification. So you can say, okay, electricity is there. So why don't you switch to electricity? So second question after it's there, what is the quality of that? How many blackouts? How reliable it is, right? So in many countries, especially rural areas, there are lots of blackouts, so not reliable. And imagine if you are living in cold Central Asia, when outside temperature, you know how much negative can it go? Anyone guess like the minimum temperature? I'm from Central Asia. The lowest temperature I experienced in my home. Anyone guess? Say just minus number. 30. Minus 30. And one more, anyone? 40, okay, great, 40, correct. Minus 40, that's the lowest temperature I experience every winter in my home, not just once in 10 years, it's every winter. So imagine then if you switch completely to electricity heating and you have minus 40 outside and it's not reliable. Then next question, okay, if it's even reliable, affordability. In cold countries, it's very expensive to heat house with electricity. That's why Mongolia, Central Asia rely on fossil fuels for heating. Then next question is financial access. Because if it's upfront, if you need to pay something upfront, let's say you need to buy water boiler, or you need to switch your heating system from coal to electricity, let's say, or gas, something. So there is upfront cost, and it's very important for household to have this access to finance because of this upfront cost. And then another barrier which is, I think, easier to address, that's about information. Households, we ask them about knowledge on energy efficiency and insulation of their house. And they were quite comfortable with knowledge on insulating windows and doors, but they said lack of knowledge on insulating walls and roofs. So there is some also how to do that. So if household already willing, how to do that. So there is some issues they prioritize, and awareness, of course, is necessary, but because I think in many countries awareness is already very high. So there are other things which household prioritize, and it's very important, yeah, that when policy design, that we're aware of these barriers. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dina. So I wanted to ask all the panelists a forward-looking question before we open it up to the Q&A. Looking ahead 10 years, what would success look like to you for equity-centered energy policy frameworks? So maybe we'll start with Yejin.
So very much in terms of equity and these projects that we want to build, the clean energy projects, what we found from the survey is everybody cares very much about jobs. And so to me, success in 10 years would be that there are more jobs in the energy transition sector that have been created through these policies and these projects. And the workforce is actually ready to take on these jobs because oftentimes the jobs are created, but then there's a gap between what the workforce can do and what is required. So already workforce and more jobs would be my answer. Thanks.
Thanks. Praveen, you want to go next?
Yeah, for our concept of equity, Ellen, I think for indigenous peoples, I think the first and the priority need would be recognition of historical marginalization of indigenous peoples, during the building or formation of a modern Asian states. So that requires recognition of our rights, recognition of us as distinct peoples first, that many Asian states don't do, and then our rights to our lands, territories, and resources in the national legal frameworks, including as well as our right to free, prior, and informed consent for projects, including energy projects impacting us. Again, we have some models in this region of these rights. An example could be the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in the Philippines, and I know my indigenous colleagues from the Philippines might not appreciate me using IPRA as a model because of the lack of effective implementation of the law, and whereby FPIC has been manufactured. There hasn't been genuine implementation of FPIC through genuine indigenous representatives. No, but again, it is let's say a starting point. And I think at least for recognition of our lands, territories, and resources, there are models in other countries too. Cambodia recognizes indigenous community land titles. Malaysia recognizes native customary rights. And again, as I said earlier, a lot of these countries are referencing FPIC in their energy policies, but the FPIC is still yet to be codified in laws. And what we require, again, for equity is that to be the first step, that FPIC is codified in laws, whereby decisions our collective decision-making processes, including through our traditional governance institutions, are recognized, as well as through participation, if meaningful participation of vulnerable groups within indigenous communities like women, youth, persons with disabilities. Secondly, what we would like to see in 10 years is, again, more indigenous peoples-led solutions, indigenous peoples' rights-centered solutions. We have, again, seen these solutions at small scale, at local levels in many countries in this region, but we are asking our governments, asking businesses to partner with us to scale up these solutions to utility scale. And again, we are sharing how that can be. For example, by giving examples of how Canada has been promoting indigenous-led solutions for the First Nations in the country. Again, a lot of Canadian human rights activists might not fully agree with me in how Canada promotes this, but at least there are some good practices there, whereby Canadian federal government has been providing policy incentives, through preferential purchase agreements, as well as federal grants for projects that are designed by First Nations, including energy projects, renewable energy projects that will be developed on their land, territories, and resources. And again, that is what we are asking of our governments, including regional formations like ASEAN, and hopefully we'll reach there in 10 years.
Thank you. Okay, Veronica.
Nice question, because in 10 years a lot can happen, and I would hope that countries will start delivering on the emission reductions and on getting closer to net zero. But what it will be more difficult to measure is how much more equitable are the policies that they've designed. But I think from a policy framework perspective, what I would like to see in 10 years is that the inclusive part and the equity part isn't seen as something separate from the emission reduction and renewable targets, but that it is more integrated into energy policy frameworks in the first place. That when designing energy policy, it is kind of a first thing to think about how does this affect the frontline communities? How can it lead to more jobs? How can local economic diversification take place, and how can the most vulnerable communities benefit from these? So just putting it in the center rather than at the very end of policy making.
Thanks. Now, Dina.
Thank you. Yeah, so of course, when we talk about energy transition, there are lots of issues and costs. We look about lots of challenges, but at least if in, like you said, 10 years, right? If in 10 years we can completely eliminate indoor pollution from cooking and heating, which cause lots of premature deaths. And it's not only accumulated disease which come from day-to-day breathing air pollution. When stove inefficient, children and women die immediately. So every heating season starts with news how many people died because of inefficient stove. So I think at least if we can eliminate indoor air pollution from heating and cooking, because heating and cooking is essential for life, for daily life. You cannot avoid it, right? And on the other hand, it's what's killing many people. So that's my suggestion, at least if we can eliminate this indoor air pollution from cooking and heating.
Thank you. So now we will open it up to questions from the audience. We have a mic here. How should we do this? You can line up there by the mic, I guess.
Hello, my name is Ivona. I'm also with Ecoris, Veronica's colleagues. First of all, thank you very much for your very, very interesting presentations. I have, if you don't mind, just quick questions, clarification question first for you, Dina. You mentioned that in the household, which is de facto led by women, the use of, the chances of a cleaner energy use is higher. Does it also compare to households led by men, or you compared the two different groups of women? And if yes, what in your view could we do to encourage households that are also led by men to adopt more, let's say, sustainable energy use? Just a second to look at my notes. Also, Jaejin, I'm sorry to butcher your name, I'm not sure I pronounced it well, but just wanted to ask you, in your social acceptance framework, do you also use the social impact assessment kind of methodologies when you're looking at projects? I will be really curious to hear more about the methodology, how you go about it. And really just curious to see the results of your research, because what you describe, it sounds awfully familiar from, Europe, especially Eastern European part of the trust issue, basically, not so much related to the, actual deployment of energy, but rather mistrust of the government. And then the final question for you, Prabinda, it's about the, you mentioned that one project was stopped in your country, that basically the Asian Development Bank withdrew because of the bad practices, essentially. So we know that ADB and other development banks, they have safeguard mechanisms in place. So I was just curious what kind of mechanisms you have, your organization has at its disposal when you don't have these multilateral development banks and their policies at your disposal. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to these questions and then I can ask, or I can just go ahead?
Maybe go ahead first.
Okay. I have a very small question for Ms. Ha from SCAP, because a very interesting finding that you were talking about how the urban-rural divide, that kind of caught my attention, because in the Indian context, many last mile front runners, active agents of change and adoption in clean energy solutions are primarily rural Indian, like rural folks, but also women, and I'll be talking about more on that in my session tomorrow. But wanted to understand from you, what was your experience with respect to assessing and responding to that insight, that find, that how in the Indonesian context and the other context, if um, because in my understanding, when it comes to especially clean energy, large scale solutions like solar plants, for example, these are primarily outside the city zones and rural areas, and so there is a lot of hope and, I think, potential to unlock that community's talent, to incorporate them into the workforce through various means. So it's interesting how that class kind of, I would love for you to kind of unpack that class inside a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Jesse Todok. I'm independent consultant, but currently with the UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. My question really is, because now everybody talks about energy transition, but there's still a basic issue on energy access. And I should mention in the Philippines, we still have, I think based on the latest available data from World Bank and SE for All, more than 17 million households in the Philippines, or more than 50 million Filipinos, are still relying on traditional fuels, firewood, for cooking. And I think the latest data, which is not yet published, from PSA, Philippine Statistics Authority, and DOE, it's also, about that. It's still more than 50 million Filipinos are still relying on traditional fuels. And based on some data, we are next to Laos in terms of number of deaths, in relative terms, but in absolute terms, we are probably number one because we have more than 100 million Filipinos. So my question may be for Ms. Dina, and maybe to some extent Ms. Veronica, how could we sort of take advantage of this talk on energy transition to take advantage of these talks to address this very basic problem in the Philippines, at least. And by the way, most of these regions still relying on traditional fuels have concentration of indigenous peoples, Cagayan Valley, Barm, and also northern Mindanao. These are the regions with high, many households still relying on traditional fuels. I was with DOE 30 years ago. We used to talk about privatization and regulation. Now we talk about energy transition, but we still have, I think, the same problem as far as access to clean cooking. Thank you very much.
Why don't we answer, because we have about 5 questions, and 11 minutes left. So let's answer first maybe the questions from our colleague from Ecoris.
Thank you, Imona, for your question. Yeah, so for evidence from Sri Lanka shows that female-headed households are more likely to use clean fuel. And if we compare female-headed household, those who married and versus those who are widowed, divorced. So those who are married, they are more likely to use clean fuel comparing to female who are widowed, divorced, or single. So this is between women comparison. Yeah, and for the next question, from Lizzie about how to take advantage from energy transition, and some people still rely on traditional fuel. So for countries like Philippines, right, especially where fuel is mainly imported, and recently was the shock of oil price, right, and then people had struggling how to drive to work, right? And then I noticed MRT price decreased to help people, right? Before I paid 20 peso for my ride, now I pay only 10 peso. So that's how I feel like this hit really Filipino people. Although I didn't live here long enough, but for especially countries who are importing fuel, energy transition brings more advantages, because if you will start relying on local sources of renewable energy, energy efficiency, that will reduce reliance on imported fuel, and such future shock when oil price again or another fuel price will again increase, then you'll be less sensitive to that.
And then I think there were 2 questions for Yejin.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. So on the social impact assessment, in most cases, there will be a very detailed environmental impact assessment and a social impact assessment carried out for all projects. So our kind of objective was not to duplicate that, and because they do go into very much the details. At the first instance, by looking at more of a general perception, just to get an understanding of how these projects viewed. And then we will augment that with some deep dive focus group workshops with the directly impacted communities to see if the general public perception is very different from the local community perception. And then if the disparity between the general public and the local stakeholders are found to be very big, then how do we make sure that the project design and implementation is able to narrow that gap in a way that then the local communities don't feel like they're losing out or they're like disenfranchised by the projects. So that is our kind of approach. And it will be published towards the end of the year. So, and this is, as I mentioned, a very first attempt of like kind of developing this methodology and rolling it out. So we would very much appreciate feedback once it's out. And on the question about why we're seeing the urban-rural disconnect, when in many cases, the rural households are championing these projects, right? So it also was a bit puzzling, and I think the interpretation is not 100%. It's not going to be, it's not going to be very much evidence-driven because there's only so much the surveys can do, right? But thinking about the benefits largely when the general public are interviewed, I think they would think about air pollution as one big benefit. So if you're living in city centers where air pollution is more pronounced, then maybe the clean energy projects are viewed as, okay, this is going to reduce air pollution and therefore it's going to benefit me. And then the other aspect that I was kind of thinking about was maybe in terms of like Indonesians selling energy to Singapore and earning that export revenue, the benefits would partially go towards lowering electricity prices. And invariably, urban dwellers do use a lot more electricity than rural households. So maybe that's also coming in into that result. But yeah, I would be very much interested in your session and your studies to learn more about that. Thanks.
And there's a question for you, Brad.
Yes, thanks, Ellen. Yeah, first to clarify the project that I referred to, whereby the support the financing from ADB was withdrawn, was in India, not in Nepal. It was after the affected indigenous communities protested or opposed the solar energy farm, solar power farm, because they asserted that with the ADB that the free, prior, and informed consent has not been obtained by the Indian government, more specifically the Assamese government, for the project. And after they opposed, filed a complaint with the ADB, including the ADB's accountability mechanism, the compliance review panel, based on the safeguards of the ADB, particularly the safeguards on indigenous peoples. Indian government wrote to the ADB that they were withdrawing, the financing of ADB for the said project. had ADB, financing not been there, I think within the legal frameworks of countries such as India or Nepal, again, unfortunately, the right to free, prior, and informed consent is not adequately, or even is not adequately respected or even recognized. No, in countries like India and Nepal, often FPIC is equated to conduct of public hearings for environmental impact assessment or social impact assessment, and we've been telling our governments that's not FPIC for us. FPIC is not only conduct of public hearings, whereby indigenous considerations are not given due consideration. Often our governments also say benefit sharing, equate benefit sharing with FPIC, and again we are saying benefit sharing is a part of FPIC, but not the entirety of FPIC. Yeah. So yeah, I mean. When institutions such as ADB come into play, of course there is a additional leverage. But again, we are working with our governments to also strengthen our own national frameworks. But we haven't reached there yet. In our own work, in APNI's work, whereby we are promoting indigenous-led energy solutions, I think we conduct meaningful community consultations, document these consultations, document the consent of the communities, and when we promote these solutions or support these solutions, our partners with Right Energy Partnership is in the room, who are doing this at a larger scale across the region, and they have also published resources on how to ensure FPIC in community-led energy solutions. Richard is at the back of the room if you want more information on how we do ensure this on the indigenous-led solutions that we are promoting. Make sure you can talk with Richard or also my colleague Ori, who's there at the front of the room. And just one last thing, in reference to what our colleague there said with regards to indigenous peoples also being heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and that is unfortunately the case still. However, what we have also seen is that dependence is gradually being promoted by companies, whereby even the traditional fuels like the access to traditional fuels are heavily impacting the well-being of indigenous peoples. Again, that is why we are trying to promote indigenous-led energy solutions to move away from these traditional fuels to low-carbon or renewable energy solutions.
Great, thanks. Veronica, did you want to answer Jesse's question?
Yeah, I think maybe it's a oversimplification here, but in order to, it is a priority to get these communities, get them access to the grid. And in order to reduce the deaths that are counted here every year. But the first step would be to go to those communities and see how they would want to be provided access to the grid. I would assume that a lot of these communities are based on one of the many islands of the Philippines. And yesterday at this ADB on the ground session, I heard some really great examples of rural community-owned energy systems, which are greatly kind of appreciated by these communities. So conferences like these are also really great to just hear some best practices and hopefully inspire also policymakers in the Philippines to adopt such approaches.
Thanks. So we have 10 seconds left. I see some questions came in online, but we will, our panelists will respond to them in Huva. Thank you to everyone for attending this session. I think it went well. And thank you to our panelists.